There is a type of person you have almost certainly met. Someone who makes a decision, holds a boundary, or walks away from a situation and just doesn't explain it. No lengthy justification, no apology tour, no anxious follow-up text making sure everyone understands. They simply act, and they let the action speak. And the strange thing is, something about that quiet composure makes them magnetic. It makes them feel solid in a way that's hard to name. If you've ever watched someone do that and felt a mix of admiration and genuine confusion, wondering how they do it, wondering why you can't seem to stop explaining yourself, this video is for you. Because the difference between people who constantly justify their choices and people who don't isn't personality. It isn't confidence as a trait you either have or don't. It is a specific set of psychological shifts, 5 of them to be exact, and every single one of them is learnable. Let's get into it. The first secret is this: they have internalized their values so deeply that disagreement from the outside doesn't shake what they feel on the inside. Here is something that sounds simple, but cuts pretty deep. 95% of people believe they are self-aware. Not an opinion. That finding comes from researcher Tasha Urich, who studied over 5,000 participants. The actual number of people who are genuinely self-aware? Somewhere between 10 and 15%. Most people think they know who they are. Very few actually do. And here is why that matters. When your sense of self is vague, when you haven't really examined what you value, what you stand for, what kind of person you are choosing to be, your identity becomes dependent on other people reflecting it back to you. You need their understanding. You need their approval, because without it, you genuinely don't know if you're okay. Psychologist Jennifer Campbell spent years studying what she called self-concept clarity, the degree to which your sense of self is clear, consistent, and stable across time and context. What she found is telling. People with high self-concept clarity show significantly lower neuroticism, lower social anxiety, and a dramatically reduced need for external confirmation. They don't require someone else to agree with their decision in order to feel settled in it. Think about that in real terms. When someone with high self-concept clarity decides to leave a job or end a relationship or decline an invitation, they don't feel an urgent pull to explain themselves, because the explanation they needed, they already gave themselves. They have done the internal work. The choice is settled before it's even announced. For most of us, over-explaining isn't weakness. It's a symptom of an identity that hasn't fully anchored yet. The fix isn't to force yourself to go quiet. It's to get clearer, genuinely clearer, on who you actually are. Now, here is something that will change how you think about every argument you've ever had. The second secret is that people who don't explain themselves have usually been through enough painful conversations to understand a hard truth. Explaining yourself doesn't create understanding. It hands people ammunition. There is a concept in cognitive behavioral therapy, an Al-Anon called the Jade Trap. JADE stands for justify, argue, defend, explain. And the insight behind it is uncomfortable but worth sitting with. When you are dealing with someone who is controlling, manipulative, or simply not operating in good faith, entering a JADE loop with them never produces resolution. Never. Because the loop was never designed for resolution. It was designed to extract compliance. Every justification you offer becomes a new door they can push through. You explain your reason, they attack the reason. You defend the defense, they find a new angle. You justify the justification, and suddenly you are 20 minutes into a conversation where you feel exhausted, confused, and somehow guilty, even though you haven't done anything wrong. People who rarely explain themselves have usually learned this lesson the hard way. They have been in those conversations. They have offered every reasonable explanation they had. They watched it get dismantled or ignored, and at some point, something clicked. The explaining was never the point. The explaining was the game. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start to recognize the difference between someone who genuinely wants to understand and someone who wants you to keep talking until you've said something they can use. And you stop handing people ammunition disguised as honesty. Cold or closed off? No. Discerning. You save your explanations for people who have actually earned them. Here is what silence actually signals, and it is not what most people think. Researchers at PMC published a systematic review in 2025 examining restraint as a social signal. What they found was consistent across multiple studies. Silence and non-justification in social contexts is reliably read by observers as confidence, authority, and high status. Verbal over-explanation, by contrast, is read as lower status. Lower certainty, a kind of social plea. When you over-explain, you are not demonstrating reasonableness. You are signaling that you need permission, and the people around you, even if they would never consciously articulate this, register it exactly that way. The third secret is one that most self-help content skims past, and it's arguably the most important one. People who never explain themselves have decoupled their self-worth from other people's interpretation of their behavior. Read that again. Decoupled their self-worth from other people's interpretation of their behavior. Most of us grew up in environments where being understood was tied to being safe. If you could explain yourself clearly enough, make the other person see your side, then conflict would dissolve, love would be restored, and everything would be okay. That pattern gets written into your nervous system early. And for a lot of people, the urgent need to explain in adulthood is that same childhood pattern running on autopilot, trying to make things safe by earning understanding. Attachment researchers describe securely attached adults as people who do not require external validation of their choices to feel stable in themselves. They can be misunderstood. They can be misread. They can watch someone walk away with an incorrect story about who they are and still feel fundamentally okay, not because they don't care, but because their sense of self doesn't live in other people's perception of them. The psychologist Julian Rotter spent years studying what he called locus of control. People with an internal locus, those who believe their choices and actions drive their outcomes, show lower anxiety, higher achievement, and significantly better psychological resilience than people with an external locus, who feel their worth is contingent on what others think, believe, or understand about them. When your locus is external, being misunderstood feels like an emergency. Your nervous system fires it as a genuine threat, because on some level, your identity depends on the other person getting it right. When your locus is internal, being misunderstood is just information, maybe worth addressing, maybe not, but not a crisis. The shift from external to internal locus doesn't happen through willpower. It happens through repeated small experiences of trusting yourself, making a decision, sitting with the discomfort of someone not understanding it, and discovering that you survived, that you were okay, that the world didn't end just because someone had the wrong read on you. Every time you resist the urge to over-explain and nothing catastrophic happens, your nervous system learns. It recalibrates. Over time, the silence stops feeling dangerous. Now, and this is where people get something badly wrong about this whole topic, not explaining yourself is not the same as stonewalling. The difference matters enormously. John Gottman's decades of research on couples identified stonewalling as one of the most damaging behaviors in relationships. When someone shuts down completely, goes silent, withdraws, gives nothing, it creates profound relational damage. But Gottman also identified the mechanism behind stonewalling. Principled silence has nothing to do with it. Stonewalling comes from physiological flooding. The nervous system becomes so overwhelmed that the person literally cannot engage. The silence is reactive. It is fear in disguise. Principled non-explanation is something entirely different. It is calm. It is proactive. It comes from a settled nervous system, not a flooded one. The difference is entirely internal, but it is unmistakable from the outside. One kind of silence is a wall. The other is a boundary. One pushes people away in panic. The other simply holds a line with no apology. If you have ever been accused of stonewalling when you felt like you were just setting a limit, that distinction matters. Learn to check in with your own body. Is the silence coming from peace or from shutdown? The answer tells you which one you're actually doing. The fourth secret is about understanding what silence actually communicates and choosing to trust it. The ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught one of the most useful ideas in the history of human thought. He called it the dichotomy of control. Some things are within your power, your choices, your values, your actions, your response to what happens. Everything outside of that, including what other people think of you, whether they understand you, whether they approve, sits outside your control and therefore isn't worth spending yourself on. That sounds like detachment, like not caring, but it is actually the opposite of not caring. It is caring about the right things with the right amount of energy. Epictetus was not teaching apathy. He was teaching precision. People who don't explain themselves have often arrived at a version of this understanding, whether they've read the Stoics or not. They have noticed, through lived experience, that explaining never fully closes the gap. You can spend an hour laying out your reasoning in painstaking detail, and the person who didn't want to understand still won't. You can say nothing at all, and the person who trusts you will give you the benefit of the doubt. The understanding was never really about the words. It was always about the relationship. Once you internalize that, you stop spending energy on the gap. You accept that some people will misread you. You accept that you cannot control other people's narratives, no matter how clearly you articulate your own. And you redirect that energy towards something that actually moves: your choices, your actions, the life you're actually building. Actions are the only argument worth making. Everything else is noise. The fifth secret is the one that ties everything together, and it is perhaps the hardest to sit with. People who never explain themselves trust the process of their own decisions more than they trust the comfort of being understood. Here is something worth knowing about goals and public announcement. NYU psychologist Peter Gallwitzer ran a series of studies in 2009 looking at what happens when people announce their intentions publicly. What he found runs counter to every piece of advice you've ever heard about accountability. When you tell people about a goal, your brain registers the social recognition of having shared it as a partial achievement. You get a hit of identity completion before you've done anything, and that premature sense of completion actually reduces follow-through. People who explain less do more, not as a coincidence, as a mechanism. When you keep your decisions and your process private, when you act without seeking external approval or understanding first, you preserve the full weight of the intention. The energy stays inside the action instead of leaking out through words. You have to move because the words haven't moved for you yet. But there is something deeper than strategy here. Trusting your own process means trusting that your reasons are sound even when you can't fully articulate them to someone else's satisfaction. It means being okay with making a choice that feels right to you even when others don't see it yet. It means believing, at some level, that you are a reliable source of information about your own life. That kind of self-trust is not arrogance. It is the outcome of actually doing the work to know yourself, to examine your values, your patterns, your wants. When you know yourself that clearly, you don't need to explain yourself because you've already had the conversation that mattered. You had it with yourself. So, let's pull all 5 of these together because they build on each other in a way worth seeing clearly. People who don't explain themselves carry a clear, anchored sense of who they are, so disagreement doesn't destabilize them. They have learned through hard experience that explaining to the wrong person doesn't produce understanding. It produces ammunition. They have separated their self-worth from other people's interpretation of their choices, so being misread is not a crisis. They understand that silence signals strength, not absence, and they have made peace with the fact that they cannot control other people's perceptions, and they trust their own decisions more than they need the comfort of being understood by someone who wasn't part of making them. None of this is about being cold. None of it is about withholding or being mysterious for effect. It is about being so genuinely settled in yourself that the urge to seek external confirmation simply loses its grip, not through force, through clarity. Here is the thing nobody talks about. You do not become this kind of person by deciding to stop explaining. You become this kind of person by doing the internal work until you genuinely no longer need to. The silence is the result. The work is what gets you there. So here's what I want to leave you with. Think about the last time you over-explained. A decision, a boundary, a choice about your own life. Ask yourself honestly, who were you actually trying to convince? Was it them or was it yourself? Because a lot of the time, the explaining we do out loud is a conversation we haven't finished on the inside yet. Drop a comment and tell me, which of these 5 resonated most with you? Was it the jade trap, the locus of control piece, the idea that silence is a social signal? I genuinely want to know where you are with this. If this video gave you something real to think about, hit the like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because this is exactly the kind of conversation most people are having alone in their heads, and it deserves more air. And make sure you subscribe, because next we are getting into something that connects directly to everything we just covered. Why highly self-aware people actually struggle in relationships more than most people expect, and what they do differently that changes everything. You are not going to want to miss that one.